Welcome all to our second to last event for AIMS conference. I'm excited to have you all here and very excited to discuss these wonderful presentations. This is the panel Female Reinventions Through Lore Olympus, which is a webcomic, for those of you who do not know, that I have been reading every week for the last 2 years. And I know that some of you have been reading it even longer. So without further ado, well, actually, a little bit of business. As you probably already know the process by now, as we are going through the presentations, please do send me your questions in a direct chat or anytime throughout the question and answer period. And I will be able to then send the messages or read them out to the presenters. And if you have any other questions that come up during that, please do just send that along to me. All right. So to begin, we have let's see, Persephone Revived, Modern Myth in Lore Olympus by two presenters, Patricia Moreland, who is sadly not able to join us today, but she is a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She studies immigrant non-native cavalry in ancient warfare. She is interested in ancient myths and stories and how we translate these stories to have meaning for a modern audience, particularly how popular cultural stories work to make meaning of trauma. We also have Kirtan Jakwa, is a PhD candidate also in the classics department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on female relationships in the ancient Greek tragedies. She is interested in ancient myths and stories and how we translate these stories to have meaning for a modern audience, particularly how popular cultural stories work to make meaning of trauma. So Kirsten, take it away.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here and I've enjoyed my fellow panelists' papers. So my paper asks basically the question, what cultural work these kinds of stories and myths do for us, both in ancient and modern times. And I focus on a comparison between the probably most well-known version of Persephone's story, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, and how it contrasts with Lore Olympus to ask what their unique contributions are in a cultural sense, because every myth has a value to the culture that tells it, unique value. Both stories ask what happens in the moment when a woman comes of age, at least according to the age where you are old enough to change in their cultures. And they focus on uniquely female perspectives. So we followed three specific differences in these two stories. And one is the willingness versus unwillingness, something my fellow panelists have addressed as well. So in the original, or shall we say the ancient myth, we have an unwilling transition for Persephone, whereas in this Lore Olympus modern retelling, it's very willing. She chooses and wants to be an independent young woman. The second is that in the ancient story, there's a focus on the mother's experience, Demeter's, and what the transition of the daughter growing up means for her and her experience. And in Lore Olympus, we really focus on Persephone. And the third is the question of healing and resolution. And we argue that in the ancient story, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it very much addresses a painful moment, both for the mother and the daughter, but there isn't a lot of resolution. There isn't a lot of opportunity for them to heal. And it's clear that this is a generational trauma that happens for every woman as they come of age, and it's expected. And the story expresses a lot of pain, but there isn't a lot of way to resolve or to heal from it. Whereas Lore Olympus takes the same story and I would argue has a lot of opportunities to heal. And I'll be very interested in hearing from my fellow panelists, because I think there is even some healing in the relationship between the mother and daughter. But our conclusion is that while both works want some sort of emotional outlet for the female experience, Lore Olympus has a role that many myths have today in offering that opportunity, that emotional catharsis for the female experience. So I seek to answer the question that this entire conference is asking: what has antiquity ever done for us? In the case of my paper, our paper, the answer is that just as many myths like the Iliad and Sophocles, Ajax, and Philoctetes have done in giving an opportunity for people experiencing trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder to process their experience and see it as something timeless that stretches across millennia, Lore Olympus has taken the story of Persephone and said there is something timeless in this story that we can use to explore a female experience and offer an opportunity for a different kind of trauma to be processed, experienced, and to think about how we can heal from that in a female experience. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. All right, next we have Amy Vandervelde. She is a PhD student in classics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She graduated from Macalester College in May 2021 with a BA in Classical Languages and English Literature. Her research interests include the Persephone myth's ancient texts and receptions, ancient perceptions of the afterlife, and the mythological allusions, especially in early modern literature. And her paper is Debating Love in the Underworld, How Lore Olympus Explores Relationships in the Persephone Myth.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and hear more thoughts from my panelists and all of your questions. So to recap my paper, I'm looking specifically at this question of, can the Hades and Persephone myth be told as a love story? It came from a conversation I was having with my colleague who was very adamant, no, it cannot. It's messing up students coming into mythology classes who have read things like Lore Olympus. They don't understand that the ancient myth is very much a story of sexual violence and rape, and it messes up what we're trying to teach them. And I wanted to push back a little bit against her. Yes, the original text, the ancient source that we have from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, is very much not a love story. But that doesn't take away the inherent value that receptions have in their own. So my paper is looking at the different relationships that Persephone forms throughout Lore Olympus. I looked specifically at Hades and Demeter as my primary two. Also Apollo taking over that role of Persephone's abuser and perpetrator of sexual violence against Persephone in Lore Olympus. And then also Eros, because I think having the personification of love, being best friends with Persephone, also does something in and of itself to making Lore Olympus this romantic love story between Persephone and Hades. So in looking at different receptions of the Persephone myth, from Margot Lewis's Persephone Rises 1860 to 1927, and I'm just going to repeat again here because I cannot say it any better myself. And so Lewis says, quote, "At one level, this study may seem to record a confusion of warring voices and incompatible impulses, as each writer tries to tug the goddess, Persephone, in one direction or another, making her serve the writer's own agenda. At a deeper level, this is a tale of cultural changes reflected and to some extent effected through the controversies and literary creations explored here," end quote. And I just think that the way that we have Persephone in all of these different forms, Zoe talks about 4 different ones in her paper, which was really great. And I also have read some other ones, Radiant Darkness by Emily Whitman, that I touch on in my paper a little bit, the Abandoned Trilogy by Meg Foe, the Goddess Test series by Amy Carter. There are countless receptions of the Persephone myth out there, and the most common route is changing it into a love story. And so I really wanted to look at why, and do they still have inherent value to us? And the answer that I found is yes, these receptions do have value apart from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Claudian's De Raptu Proserpinae. And some of that value does come through the comparisons and differences that they have, not necessarily just how close is this reception to the original source text that we have. So yeah, that's pretty much the basis of my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, and then we have our last panelist, Zoe Elise Thomas is a fourth-year archaeology PhD student in the classics department at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses primarily on the social dynamics of built urban environments and uses modern theories about space and social experience in order to analyze the ancient world, ranging from social functions of fortification walls in the Iliad to civic architecture and Roman imperialism in Gaul. In the field, she works on human osteology and archaeothanatology with an interest in demographics and paleopathology. Zoe has been fascinated by the classical receptions since she was a child, when her grandmother told her stories about their village, Champtocé-sur-Loire, sorry for my French, being named after Julius Caesar. She's particularly interested in the way that narratives about women from Greco-Roman myth are adapted and romanticized for contemporary audiences, and the recreation of antiquity in video games. When she's not teaching or doing her research, you can find her tweeting too much at Archigne on Twitter. Great, and her presentation is on Demeter and motherhood in modern receptions of Hades and Persephone.
Thank you. Thank you both to the conference organizers and my fellow panelists. And David, I'm so sorry for throwing all of the hard to pronounce things at you. Very briefly, I should start with apologizing yet again to Linda Sejic. Those of you that got the chance to watch my talk probably noticed, both because I started with a big errata slide, but also because I switched back and forth between her real name, which is Linda Sejic, and kept calling her Lisa Sejic. So Linda Sejic, if you ever see this, I am so very sorry for misattributing your wonderful comic. I should also say a brief content warning. I think this is probably pretty obvious based on the content that all of us are going to be talking about. But specifically with my paper, I deal a lot with explicit themes of parent-child abuse, sexual abuse and rape, incest. So I just want to warn everyone, just in case you weren't sure or didn't realize that that would be a topic for discussion today, especially for my paper, which deals pretty heavily with those topics. Moving right along, as a brief recap, I surveyed 4 different receptions. So I focused a little bit on Lore Olympus, but overall, I was actually looking at 4 different romance receptions. So Punderworld by Linda Sejic, which is another webtoon turned published graphic novel. Neon Gods by Katie Robert, which is a romance novel. And The Dark Wife by Sarah Deemer, which is a young adult romance novel that actually reimagines Hades and Persephone as a lesbian romance. So Hades is actually a woman in Sarah Deemer's work. Specifically, I was interested in looking at the narrative trend, which Amy pulled out in her presentation as well, of casting Demeter as a villain as a way to sort of, you could argue sanitize, you could also argue create sort of the path for a romance to bloom between Hades and Persephone, and primarily as a way to create Persephone's leaving of Demeter as a voluntary action. Specifically, I was approaching this from the perspective of modern sort of anthropological and sociological studies on motherhood. So I was looking at Demeter's behavior in these 4 works as being cast as being abusive in terms of her violation of the most popular modern mothering ideology, which is intensive mothering, where a mother's entire sort of identity and personhood is expected to be secondary to their role as a mother. This is very common in terms of themes of work, so working mothers. In particular, I discussed how Demeter's bad mothering, quote unquote, appears in 4 different tropes across these 4 works. Primarily, 1, she's hyper controlling of Persephone's actions, social life, and sex life. 2, that she refuses to accept Persephone as an adult capable of making her own decisions. 3, she projects her personal ambitions onto Persephone. And 4, she is usually obsessed with work, either normally it has to do with growing grain and feeding people in all 4. My preliminary thoughts at the end of my presentation come down to sort of the potential sociological effects of this very common narrative trend, namely that the vilification of Demeter in this way perpetuates modern ideologies about what makes a good, heavy air quote, versus a bad mother. Since romance literature has a profound impact on the way that readers think about and consider love, sex, and personal relationships, both familial and romantic relationships. And I argue, well, I think, maybe people disagree, I'm more than happy to discuss this because I think it's fascinating. But I think this could contribute to the further stigmatization of working mothers and mothers who don't conform to the expected mothering ideal of intensive mothering. So that is my presentation. Thank you. And I'm so excited for our Q&A panel today.
Excellent. All right, let's dive in with some questions then. So let's see, for the first one here, from Alicia Matt, for both Kirsten and Amy here. While the Homeric hymn Demeter is the main source of the Persephone myth, it is not the only one. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, the abduction is immediate. Persephone is described as unwilling, and Ovid uses rapio. Ovid is an astute commentator on social aspects of his story, and there is no way you could read this version as love. How do you reconcile the love story aspect with Ovid's more blunt portrayal? So let's start with Kirsten and Amy.
I did talk about that a little bit because I think there's a lot of it obviously being very aware of what is different between now and then. It's a very cultural element. There's a little bit that I talk about in my discussion of how there's actually, in the typical marriage ceremony that happens in ancient Greece, there's clear evidence that they stage marriages as a snatching away or a kidnapping. So it's obviously a very unhealthy portrayal, but whether or not the woman, we don't know her feelings in most of these marriage situations, whether or not she was happy to go away from her home life. The very fabric of how a marriage was staged in the ancient world was so that they made a make-believe kidnapping. And I think that is kind of an element in it. And when they portray it in literature, they're sort of fantasizing, dramatizing what a normal marriage would look like. So there's an element of that. That is not to say that it is not, it's a very uncomfortable topic, of course, but I think that there is an element of that's how it was culturally staged. And also, of course, that, the concept of romance wasn't really something that they brought into the idea of getting married. That came into later literature, like of the Greek novel. They started to talk about actually having a romance where the female desire was actually wanted and encouraged within a marriage. Whereas in ancient Greece and the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it was not. And Ovid was definitely playing off of that. I don't know if that answers your question. That's a lot of thoughts on sort of the cultural context surrounding it. And I'd love to hear from, who else was it? Zoe or Amy? I forget. I'm sorry.
I think it was geared at me.
Yes.
You answered that very wonderfully, Kirsten. I don't know if I have much to add to that, other than in receptions, it's important not to just look at the original text and how it is similar to a modern adaptation, but the differences add in a lot. And so Ovid's Metamorphoses' rendition of the Persephone myth is much harsher than the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And I don't know if there is necessarily a way where we can say, I don't know if we can work with it that well.
I also just thought, and you are probably aware of this too, that Ovid, there's a lot of context to Ovid stories, and the Metamorphoses in particular, Ovid, there are a lot of scholars that argue that Ovid is trying to portray authority as particularly toxic and disturbing. And he got himself banished because of the way that he wrote his poetry in a way that was critical and also making fun of concepts that Augustus was putting forth into the culture at the time of this beautiful, perfect family that was supposed to be a microcosm for the empire. And so Ovid always portrays the gods as authorities figures that are overbearing and extremely problematic. And there's an element of that too.
Yeah, Alicia, that's a very good question.
It is.
Alicia, yeah. I'm going to have to think more on it because I don't know if I have an ad lib answer right off of that, other than it's something we definitely have to continue to grapple with.
But yeah, we appreciate the thought. It's really important.
Just remain objective and detached. And then everybody listens to an interview of.
Okay. We got, I don't know what that was. All right, question for Zoe. Let's see here.
On mute.
This is partly mine, partly also a question from Alicia again. All four comic/books that you talk about are written by younger women. Could the vilification of Demeter be the result of a generational reaction against earlier ideas of womanhood? And dovetailing with that, Alicia asks, could this new emphasis on consent with Persephone also be a sort of feminist take?
Sorry, I was just taking notes so I didn't miss anything. So to start with the idea of early womanhood, there is there's a very interesting book that I read in preparation for this that is all about the psychology, or the Freudian psychology, really, and whether you subscribe to Freud or not is not my area of expertise. I personally do not subscribe to Freud, but there is a very interesting theory about a young woman coming into her own is fundamentally a separation from the mother, and that the creation of a young woman's identity has to be separate from their mother's identity because we exist in a patriarchal world, and therefore your entire identity cannot be. It has to be completely divorced from women in your life because you need to be in accordance with men instead. I think my core problem with that approach is that it is extremely white, Western, heterosexual in its sort of understanding of the way that mothers and daughters get along. So I'm not saying that, if any of these authors who, as you noted, are young for the most part, I think Rachel Smythe is in her mid to late 30s. These are not, they're not from the 1800s, right? I don't mean to say that any of their experiences that they may have had with their mothers aren't valid if that's sort of how they're exploring their experiences in these pieces of work. But I do think that it portrays mother-daughter relationships in this sort of inherently negative light of a woman must divorce herself completely from her mother in order to be independent, which simply isn't true around the global experience of women, right? So there's a lot of anthropological theory about different ways of mothering. And so that's kind of my way of saying that is I think, yes, that is absolutely playing a role in the way that young authors and young creators are navigating their own experiences with their own mother or mother figures in their lives, or the way they've seen other people interact with mothers and mother figures. But I don't think it's sort of hearkening back to a universal experience between mothers and daughters. And it does get back to this issue of thinking of motherhood in this Western white heterosexual context. As for the second question, thank you, Alicia. I think so. What I wrote down was, are these feminist takes based on consent? So I apologize if that's not 100% what your question was, but I'm just going to roll with that for now. Do I think these are feminist takes? I think in many ways, these receptions, specifically the four I studied for this, have many feminist elements. They do return agency to someone who in the original myth does not have the same kind of agency. They do deal with issues of trauma, as Kirsten and I'm so sorry, your fellow panelist's name, and I cannot remember it at the moment.
Patricia.
Thank you. They do deal with these issues that I think are very core to modern sort of third wave feminist theory from an anthropological standpoint. The taking of an ancient myth like the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is fundamentally about two women and their bond, and then turning it into a story about one of those women being abusive to the other doesn't really ring feminist to me. I think that would be more in line with second wave feminism, which is sorry, I'm not going to get into anthropological theory right now, but is sort of a earlier iteration of the understanding of women's relationships with each other. I would say for that aspect, I mean, it's hard to, like, you can't just say it's not feminist or it is feminist. I think they all have feminist aspects, and I think they all have feminist leanings, but I think that the actual taking of the Homeric hymn to Demeter and turning it into women pitted against women, there's eventually, you know, a reconciliation, which I think happens in all four of these at the end. I still think that initial change from the myth is problematic. As for issues of consent, sorry, everyone. Clearly, I just have a lot of thoughts about this. As for issues of consent, content warning, I'm going to get into sort of sexology right now. Interestingly, there's actually a very large number of women who have self-reported to fantasize about dubious consent scenarios. And if you're not familiar with sex and studies of sex, sexual fantasies are very different from what you actually condone in real life. So you can fantasize about a sexual scenario and find that physically or mentally gratifying while not actually condoning that behavior in real life. It's something like 37 to 51% of women across a 20-year period self-identified as having fantasies about dubious consent in sexual scenarios. So I think it's very interesting that in modern receptions of the myth and modern romance receptions, right? I'm speaking to a very limited part of the broader reception, that there's a trend towards not leaning into that, because I think there are enough people that find that kind of a scenario stimulating, for lack of a better word, that you could probably market it very well without removing the original sort of story of the myth. Obviously, you might be changing sort of the audience that you're receiving. So Neon Gods of these four receptions is the most erotic. It's a sexy romance novel in a way that the other three are not. They may have sexual themes and sexual elements, but they're not pornographic. So I think it's interesting. Obviously, the idea of consent and informed consent is a really important part of feminist thought about sex and having sex and partaking in romantic relationships. So I think it's an interesting sort of issue to tackle, especially with these romantic receptions, because the original myth didn't have that. So sorry for my extremely long-winded response. I would love to hear from Kirsten or Amy about their thoughts as well.
This is more of a sort of a one-off thought, but as far as the dubious consent question goes, you only need to look so far as the Phantom of the Opera to find something that seems very inspired by the Persephone story and definitely has dubious consent and is wildly popular.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Next question is for all three panelists, and is from Natalie Swain. As many of you considered the role of Demeter as well as Kirsten's look at female trauma, I'm wondering if any of you are aware of modern retellings that follow Demeter and the experience of modern single motherhood. I'm certainly not, so I'm very curious.
So I can't think of any off the top of my head, which is, I think, telling that there's most receptions of the original myth veer towards this sort of love romantic one, to the not exclusion of Demeter's experiences, but to the spotlighting of Persephone's experiences. I know there is a series of poems, and I cannot remember the author's name, but they're, oh shoot, I'll have to think about it and see if I can remember the author's name and write them down. Kirsten, I saw you had yourself unmuted, so.
Oh, no, I was just, I think, honestly, I think Zoe's work addresses that the most. I really appreciated her take on it because I did notice the shift to Persephone and the way Demeter became a little bit of an antagonist. So I really appreciated your perspective and highlighting some of those moments like to Persephone's nightmare, to think about that. I do think they refer to her experience as a single mother quite a bit in Lore Olympus, and her anxieties about introducing Persephone into what she perceives very understandably to be quite a dangerous world. And I really liked hearing from you about that because I had not thought as deeply about what it meant to change the story that way and represent Demeter that way, and how important it is to consider mothers and the way mothers are represented in this story. But yeah, maybe that is needed. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, it is a really good question. I can't think of any either. Immediately when you brought up the topic of mothers in like mythology, modern retellings, I thought of Daisy Johnson's Everything Under, which is actually an Oedipus Rex retelling, which I think, it's been a while since I've read it, but I think it's completely, the genders are swapped of certain characters, which is a really intense read in that design, but it's definitely, there's a theme of motherhood in that one. So that's something close, but it's not focused on the Persephone myth, and I can't think of any with a Demeter focus.
I would like to take this opportunity to remind everybody that we are accepting submissions of fan fiction. So if this story does not yet exist, you could be the one to create it. All right. Next question is again for everybody from Amy. Daniel Curley was first. How does the comics medium, particularly the web comics medium, lend new emphasis to the Demeter and Persephone myth?
Amy, you had
Kirsten,
yourself unmuted first.
Oh, go ahead, Kirsten. I think you had a lot with I loved your music staff.
I only just got to brush shoulders with this because I was very much focused on the idea of a story that allows the female experience to have healing from trauma, which I really enjoy. But that was where I really focused. One thing that I have been fascinated by in this story, the original that I'm addressing, that it certainly touches on the most, albeit it brushes against other ancient stories, is the Homeric Hymn to Demeter, which would have been a musical representation. We don't have any of the music. I really wish we do. I study choral lyric in ancient Greek tragedy, but I think it's really compelling to me that because we know the Homeric Hymn to Demeter would have been presented in a musical format, that music is such a powerful theme within the story of Lore Olympus, and it ends up being a part of Persephone's trauma because the person who assaulted her was a god of music. And it's represented in the panels by sort of twisting through them like a musical staff, but it's not quite the way it's supposed to. It kind of twists and loops and bends back on itself as it trickles through the panels, like a visual representation. And I remember seeing a conversation on a forum that I was part of where people were like, what do you imagine in your head when you see that musical staff running through the panels? Are you imagining discordant tunes? Are you imagining a screech? What do you imagine is happening? And to me, that was so compelling because the story, the original was musical, and music is this representation of how Persephone is feeling. And then as she starts to heal in one of the most recent episodes, hopefully we're not spoiling this for anyone, as she starts to heal in a later episode, the staff is coming through the panels and it straightens out into a normal staff that's coming down in the regular 4 lines, and it turns into the weaving that Persephone creates of a tree, which is this really compelling physical representation of her healing and how she starts to use this experience that she had and create something from it. And since Persephone is a creator of life as the goddess of spring, I thought that was a fascinating representation. So yeah, the visual medium, I think, does so much to tell a really interesting story. And on top of that, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop shortly, but on top of that, there are also visuals from ancient Greece that she brings in. So the image of Persephone on the horse there's an image earlier on it where he has Minthi riding on a horse, Hades, and he brings Persephone in on a horse as well. This is an image from an ancient Greek vase that represents marriage, the husband leading the new wife on a horse with the veil over her face. So I, have to applaud Rachel Smythe for some very compelling images that she brings in from the ancient lore into these stories. But I would love to hear from the other panelists. I will mute myself now.
Yeah, I think I really love that you noted that Nikolstadt instance, because it's something that I didn't catch the first time reading through, and then I eventually, as I've been going back, I caught it. But I really like the comic setting because it keeps people engaged weekly. You have to wait for that new episode to come out. And I like the idea that, and I talked about this a little bit in my paper, we know the eventual ending. Persephone will become queen of the underworld. I don't believe that Smythe is going to, completely tear down the myth as we know it, at least in its end form of who Persephone will become. And I think that it's interesting. We all can know that and yet still be surprised by so many things that keep showing up in the myth, in this retelling, because it's brand new in and of itself.
Speak a little bit about Punderworld, which is a different graphic novel / comic. So Linda Sejic's art style is quite different from Rachel Smythe's. It's a little bit more sort of realism oriented. It's still very much a comic, however. But one thing I think that's interesting between both Rachel Smythe and Linda Sejic's work is the inclusion, as Kirsten sort of brought up, of ancient elements. So Punderworld is set in the ancient world, not in the modern world. And so I think it's probably a little bit easier to bring in a lot of those ancient elements artistically. But they both do a really beautiful job. And I think Linda Sejic in particular does an excellent job of her character designs are all extremely thoughtfully done. So at the end of her recently printed graphic novel, she talks about how she actually goes about and comes up with all the character designs, which is actually where she mentions the Homeric hymn to Demeter, and how she's been using sort of ancient evidence in order to inform her character designs. So I think graphic novels have the opportunity to bring a secondary dimension to our understanding of the story and to these retellings of the stories that romance novels, for lack of another thing to compare it to, don't necessarily get the same opportunity to do.
As a follow-up question, Amy Norgard asks, concerning the webcomic format, is something lost in the telling of Lore Olympus and Punderworld now that it's in book format, as opposed to online?
Oh, I thought Zoe would have a lot to say about this. I am not familiar with Punderworld, so I'd love to hear from her. But she did bring up I think it was you who brought up the week by week waiting each week for the installment, or was that Amy? Yeah, that is lost, and I have really enjoyed that. As much as sometimes I would like to have the next installment right away, there is something very compelling about waiting all week, and I'll discuss it with my fellow friends who read it and speculate, and that's very enjoyable. When it moves to the book format, I imagine you do lose that.
I will say there's some really interesting reformatting that happens. So I don't own the Lore Olympus print book, but I did buy the Punderworld print version, and there's interesting reformatting that happens that actually sort of changes some of the interpretations of panels, not in a drastic way. There's no plot differences, but the print format, because in a webtoon, if you're not familiar, it's this vertical format, and so it's quite difficult to sort of have multiple comic panels going on at the same time. Most of your comic gutters, which are the spaces in between comic panels where action happens, those end up being either diagonal or horizontal. It's hard to get vertical ones in there. And that's something that the print versions can play with a lot more. So it looks more traditionally like a superhero comic book, which we might be more familiar with seeing. I will also say Webtoon is a capitalist app. And so they do have a lot of issues. Well, okay, maybe issues isn't the right word. They do capitalize on the fact that people are eager for the next episode, and they have a whole system in place where you can pre-buy access to things. So, I mean, you pay for a graphic novel too, but there is, I think, an interesting potential sticking point to using Webtoon and webcomics like that, because it does sort of put this capitalist spin on things. So
I always hoped that that money went to the creator. I don't.
All right, for Amy, when we reconceptualize the Persephone's and Hades story as a love story, what do we gain, and also I suppose in Lore Olympus, displacing that sexual assault onto Apollo? What do we gain and what do we lose in our discussion of rape narratives?
Big question. So, well, with Lore Olympus, unfortunately, the content warning is still there. So rape and sexual violence are still much a part of Persephone's life. In other retellings, sometimes that disappears completely. I don't think that one way is particularly better than another. In Lore Olympus, I think, Kirsten, it was in your and Patricia's talk where you mentioned Chiron and the therapy that Persephone receives. So we're seeing that added element of how we modernize trauma, and how we do have like therapists and places to go for help that in the ancient myth, we don't see any of that. In fact, we don't even see Persephone's like own feelings about anything that really happened in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, apart from when she briefly recaps the entire narrative. And I think it's 50 or so lines out of the 500 line poem. She gets to speak her own voice. And so I'm not going to get to the crux of the question very well here. But I think there are gains and losses, and we have to grapple with them yet again, just like with the Ovid's Metamorphoses that we were talking about earlier. In Lore Olympus, we see healing, and hopefully we will see more healing as this goes on. Some losses are, as Zoe pointed out, we lose Demeter's bond with Persephone completely in some retellings in order to rewrite this myth as a love story. And so there are lots of gains and losses, and most of it is how much are we focusing on Persephone versus how much are we focusing on other characters. I'd love to have Kirsten and Zoe jump in if they have anything to add or clear up with what I said.
Great. This is again to all of the panelists from Sierra Chiano. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'm curious how the panelists feel about the visual representation of Persephone in Lore Olympus. I've always found it interesting that the gaze of the comic sexualizes Persephone to such a degree, seemingly more than other female characters.
I have a lot of feelings about that, actually. I take a lot of issue with the way that Persephone is depicted in the Madonna horror complex style, where she is extremely sexualized from the get-go, but is also extremely naive and could never be intentionally sexy unless, you know, Artemis gives her a dress that happens to be too short and booby. So I personally find that extremely troublesome. Especially considering her personality, what she goes through, and of course, for me, considering the original myth as well. I will turn it over to my other panelists, however, because they have worked on more extensively on Lore Olympus than me. So,
I mean, I think that was great, Zoe. I think my problem always is it comes up and it makes me think about what she's wearing too much. Like, I'm watching the episode and I'm like, wait a minute, what's happening? I think it's episode 12 because I talk about it in my paper when Eros comes to apologize for, putting the drunk Persephone in Hades' car at his mother's whim, and she's not wearing pants. And of course, our attention is drawn to it because Artemis is like, what did I tell you about pants? And of course, Persephone is, as Zoe said, completely too naive to have even thought about putting on pants to answer the door. So yeah, Kirsten, I'd love to hear what you have to say as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a problematic element. I completely agree with Zoe, and I hope maybe we'll have a chance to follow up because I wonder what the other comics that she brought, the stories that she brought in, how they handled this. I'd love to hear that. I think one thing that I thought about a lot is that Persephone is represented as someone who's been incredibly sheltered. She has all these experiences that we start to unpack as she grows through the story. And this is not in any way to excuse the fact that, as Zoe said, she seems, very sexualized and falls into a trope that you can look up on YouTube called Born Sexy Yesterday, very attractive and doesn't really know it and too naive, but just effortlessly attractive and has no awareness of her sexuality. Very problematic trope. Appears a lot in sci-fi. But one thing that is interesting to me is that over the course of the story, Persephone sort of discovers her own interest in sexuality. And it seems to me, again, now we're falling into the Demeter's being villainized a little bit. Demeter has tried to raise Persephone to believe that she is basically asexual. She's basically imposed that identity on Persephone through the story. And aside from this problematic element, I did find it interesting. And I think that one thing that the art perhaps is trying to show is that Persephone has always had an interest in sexuality. She wasn't allowed to explore it or understand it. And once she is independent and starts to get to know friends like Eros who help her unpack what's happened to her and who she really wants to be, she discovers that she actually does have an interest in sexuality and wants to be attractive in that way because she finds that enjoyable and because that's something she wants in her life. And so outside of the problematic element, that's at least one area where I saw that art trying to say something that maybe wasn't as well said as it should have been, but is actually an interesting idea of what does it look like for you if you've never been allowed to have an interest in sexuality, but it's still there and you're still discovering it.
Yeah, so to address Kirsten's point about the other sort of receptions of this. Interestingly, the other ones, Persephone is naive, but not in the same way that she is in Lore Olympus. In Lore Olympus, she's naive to the point of, causing danger to herself, having been so sheltered and so sort of cut off and isolated from the rest of the world as she grew up. In Punderworld, Persephone is she's not sexualized in the same way that she is in Lore Olympus, but she is still beautiful. She has a short, sort of little flirty dress. But Persephone is much more right off the bat, very sexual. She's attracted to Hades the first time she meets him. She's very interested in pursuing a sexual relationship with him. There doesn't seem to be any sort of that will they, won't they kind of idea, because she just right off the bat is like, oh, no, I do want to tap that. And that is true as well for Neon Gods, which is, again, sort of a very explicit romance novel. Persephone is interested in pursuing a sexual relationship. Some of the issues that slow down their sexual relationship are related to sort of kinks and things like that. So I think the Madonna whore thing, so within the four that I looked at, is limited to Lore Olympus. Sarah Deemer's book is also a young adult novel, and so while there is sex, Hades and Persephone do eventually have sex. It's all very sort of fade to black, and it's not. She's not inherently sexualized in the same way. But it would be interesting to do sort of a comparative look at the art between Underworld and Lore Olympus, because it's difficult to say whether Neon Gods or The Dark Wife really visually sexualize their characters, because they just don't appear in the same way.
Excellent. This is another question for Zoe. Let's see. Do you know George? This is from Roger McFarlane. Do you know George O'Connor's Hades, Lord of the Underworld, which is an adaptation of the same myth? Demeter is a helicopter mother there as well. Does its publication in 2012 or its artistic portrayal allow or exclude it as a possible antecedent for any of the publications you treat in your paper?
That's a very good question. So Sarah Deemer's book is actually from 2011, I think. It's not from the last few years, in the same way that Lore Olympus and Underworld and Neon Gods are. However, one thing that actually put me onto this topic, and it's a shame that Makiesh, I'm so sorry that he's not here, because he kind of helped me get onto this. There's a fan fiction of Disney's Hercules that came out, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s, that is a Demeter Persephone romance that is fan fiction of Disney's Hercules. So I'm not sure where the original interpretation of this myth, making it into a romantic story like this, where Demeter is sort of the villainized, overprotective mother, I have no clue where the original antecedent came from. My guess would be from fairy tales and evil stepmother tropes. I did a little bit of research onto that, but none of the 4 authors that I looked at acknowledge that as any part of their sort of inspiration. They're all very focused on the ancient material as their conscious form of inspiration for the way they tell the story. I was not familiar with that reception. I've been getting some great direct chats from people going, "Oh, have you read this?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't. And I'll add it to my list because there's so many." So thank you for that. I will absolutely take a look at it for future research. So.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. And if you can keep it kind of brief, well, 2 minutes apiece. This is another from Alicia Matz. Going back to how Persephone is depicted in Lore Olympus, do you think that this is a subtle form of slut shaming in a way that echoes the Persephone was a beautiful maiden in her own and therefore fair game implicit in the Homeric hymn to Demeter?
That's a tough question to answer because there's so much context to both stories. For the Homeric hymn to Demeter, my impression as someone who's taught myth way too many times as a grad student now is that the portrayal of her wasn't necessarily so much she's available to anyone, beautiful maiden, but that when you see a young girl of that age out in nature, plucking gathering flowers, that's kind of a very typical myth signal that that's a girl who's coming of age. She has separated from her childhood home. She's out in nature, which is a liminal space. She's departed from her safe childhood space. And so I guess, there's a availability implication there, but it's very sort of a cultural image, I think. As for the, shaming of Persephone and Lore Olympus, I'm not sure that's what the author intended, but as Zoe said, it's still a very problematic image. I wonder what you guys have to say.
Yeah, I'm also going to add that I would love to know what Smythe, if it's intended or not, because we can read it either way, I feel like, at this point, without knowing that authorial intent. Because it's definitely in that tiny, short little draft from the first episode that draws Hades' eye when I think it's Odysseus runs into her or something and knocks her over at that first party. And he says, "Wow, she's putting Aphrodite to shame." And that starts the whole roller coaster that we've all been reading. And so I think it could be read as potential slut shaming, but I don't think that's my intent particularly. if I had to guess.
Yeah, I think I concur with my panelists. I don't think the intention is to shame Persephone because, as Kirsten's presentation noted, it is definitely a narrative about healing post-sexual trauma. So I don't think that Smythe would be interested in putting down Persephone in that way. But it is interesting. I will admit, I don't think there are any other instances in Lore Olympus of someone being sexually assaulted on screen, but I don't know for sure. And I think it is unfortunate that Persephone is the only character that gets explicitly sexually assaulted on screen, and she also happens to be the most sexualized character. So
we could also ask that question about Minthy, who gets she's such a complicated character. To me, there is perhaps a hint of what might be slut shaming with Minthy, because she really just throws herself at people. But I discussed this with a friend of mine. I know a lot of readers were angry about that bunny trail about Minthy's background. I actually liked getting some background because I felt that she deserved a little sympathy for being someone in a bad situation. So I think there are flavors of that. My guess is that that's not what the author means. And that perhaps even that little background on Minthy was meant to imply, like, no, that's not what I meant. She's in a bad situation. There are reasons how she ended up here. But again, that there are problematic elements to the representations. Minthy is also very sexualized, I would say.
Okay, I think it's about time to wrap up. So just want to say thank you again to all of our panelists. And if everybody could give them a virtual round of applause, however you end up doing that. I think we have some really great insights into Lore Olympus that we didn't have before. I will point out that we do have one more activity left tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are going to have the Classics Twitter movie watching thing where we all watch it together and make comments on Twitter on the life of Brian. So from which this conference takes its theme. So I hope to see you all there. And once again, thank you so much all for coming.